Alright, in this video I'll be putting together a GT Aggressor Pro that I bought for one of my kids. Price on this was $390 Canadian, which is about $290 US. So it was on for 50% off, which is why I bought it. At full price, the comparable models are probably a Giant ATX or Giant Talon 5, a Trek Marlin 4 or 5, Specialized Rockhopper base model, or a Cannondale Trail 7 probably. And just going over the packaging on this thing, I think that GT has done a really good job at packaging up their bike. The only thing I would say is the front tube probably has a hole in it. I find it's losing air. So I've already bought another tube, not that big of a deal, but still kind of a bit of an annoyance when you open something from the package and it's just not holding air. So I'm assuming there's a leak or hole in the tube somewhere. I do take off all of the reflectors. I don't use them on my own bike and we don't really ride at night. So that's it, I do remove them and I get all the cable ties off. I'm just using side cutters, but scissors would also work. And to assemble this thing, I use a set of Allen keys or hex wrenches, and the ones you really need are the 3, 4, 5, and 6 millimeter ones. I got a couple screwdrivers, a couple pairs of pliers, a 15 millimeter wrench. I got some chain oil and some grease, and I also use a bike pump. And that's pretty much it. So a real basic toolkit can assemble this bike without very much difficulty. Now I did buy this bike pretty much sight unseen and didn't test it against the other models because it was half price. If this bike was full price and was the same as the equivalent Trek, Giant, Specialized, Cannondale, a couple others, I probably would have at least tried those bikes out. But because this was half price, it seemed like a no-brainer that this was the winner out of those ones to get the kids out mountain biking. And this will be fun for the summer, and I could work with the kids on how to build a mountain bike and how to replace parts, that kind of thing. So it'll give me something to do and a couple more YouTube videos. That's all good. So in those boxes there was pedals and a quick release and an instructional book, and those are the pedals. So the first thing I'm going to put on the bike is the seat and seat post, and it's held in place by quick release, so that's super easy. And I found that the seat was actually at a pretty good angle. There's a chance that you would need to adjust the seat on the seat post, but in my case it wasn't required. And once again, I'm going to remove the reflectors off the spokes, and I'm just using a screwdriver for that. And then I have some Phil's bike grease that I'm going to apply to the quick releases just to put a layer of protection on them. Obviously they get wet and dirty, and I will put the quick release through the front hub. Pretty simple so far. And the fork that comes with this thing is a Suntour XCT. It is not an air fork, so it's not the smoothest fork out there, but at this price range, obviously the 400 Canadian up to probably almost 1,000 Canadian, probably about 800 US, you're not getting an air fork, generally speaking, on the new market, maybe on the used market. So I'll remove the top cap, and then there's a protective cardboard tube that needs to come off as well prior to putting on the stem and handlebars. Obviously you need to route the cabling so that it doesn't get all bound up when you're trying to turn your handlebars. So it should be pretty obvious where the cables need to go when you put the stem on. And I found that the only thing that wasn't very well assembled on this was the front brakes. Everything else, rear brakes, shifters, all that stuff was good to go. Now I'll put all the bolts on loosely. So first the top cap, and then there's 2 bolts that hold the stem onto the front fork. And I'm only putting those on loosely. Like I said, once I get the front tire on, I'll tighten everything up. And one thing I would say is you want to go around and make sure all the bolts are actually properly tightened. I found a few things that were a little bit loose. So definitely check the things that you don't install. Obviously if you install it, make sure that they're tightened properly, but go around, check all the bolts, particularly those that you don't touch otherwise, to make sure that they're actually properly installed and not just loosely hanging there, because coming from the factory there is a chance that it wasn't well installed. But generally I found this bike was well put together. And once the handlebars and stem are loosely on the bike, I will throw the front tire on. Pretty simple process. Obviously, you need to make sure the disc brake goes in between the brake pads, and then just secure the front quick release. Like I said, the seat's at a pretty decent angle, so I'm going to leave it for now. Maybe I'll go back and revisit that, but for now it's good. The handlebars are angled way too high up, so I'm going to have to angle those down, but I'll do that in a few minutes. So you can see the brake is very loose on the fork in the front. In the rear that wasn't the problem, but obviously I'll have to come around and fix that. And for the pedals, they are labeled right and left, so you can't really get them confused with which one to go where. Overall, it's a pretty foolproof process. And if you just hold the nut and turn the pedals backwards, so the opposite direction you pedal, it should tighten them down. And for the actual tightening of the pedals, I'm using a 15mm wrench. And even you can see on the crank arms, they are labeled left and right. So it should be very obvious which pedal goes with which crank arm. You don't necessarily need bike-specific wrenches for this. However, if you have something that's really thick, like an adjustable wrench, it can get pinched between the pedal and the crank arm, and in which case you're not going to be able to get it tight. So having something that's thin is beneficial. And now that things are generally put together, I'll just make sure that the stem and front tire are straight, so that when you're going straight, the actual stem and handlebar and tires all line up properly, and so that they're not off on some strange angle. And once I'm happy with where it's sitting, I'll come and tighten the bolts on the stem and the top cap. And one thing to point out, if you're using an Allen key or like I am a socket, don't over tighten them. These bolts can strip out fairly easy, I find. They're a little bit soft on the bolt heads. And for changing the angle of the handlebar, there's just the 4 bolts up front. So I'll just loosen those, get this to a reasonable angle where the brakes are facing down slightly as opposed to up, and then I will tighten the handlebar back down. Once again, making sure not to over tighten anything. Just needs to be snug and make sure nothing moves around. Pretty simple. And I do tighten the brakes down. Like I said, everything's Allen key or hex keys, and brakes are no different. Definitely you want all of the brake components tight and properly secured against the fork so that they don't come ripping off when you go try to stop. And as mentioned, the front brakes weren't really set up, so I did have to run the cable through and tighten it down. But again, very easy process, pretty simple. I do have a chain stay protector so that the chain doesn't beat the paint up on the frame. And there was a little cap that came in the bag, and that goes on the cable for the front brakes. For tire pressure, I brought them up to 30 psi, and that's pretty much it. One of the things I don't like about this is the braking system. You can see when you brake, it actually pushes the rotor sideways, so it kind of bends the rotors, and it does that in the front and back. So if you're really heavy and going fast, it could be a problem. The other thing I don't really like is the cable connectors or cable clips on the brake frame. All the competitors for this bike, they're all generally using internal routing now for the cables, so this is a little bit dated on the GT Aggressor Pro. And then all the shifters were well set up. You might need to adjust the high-low setting, so that's where the screwdrivers might come in handy. And here's the rear brake. You can see once again how far that brake actually pushes the brake rotor sideways. So I'm not a big fan of that, and honestly these brakes aren't great. It's one of the weaker things on the bike is probably these brakes. But pretty much everything is highly upgradable on this bike. It obviously has an aluminum frame, and I think overall this is going to be a fun project, and it'll teach the kids about doing some basic maintenance on a bike and how to build stuff. So they'll have fun with it, I'll have fun with it, make some YouTube videos and get some content on a GT Aggressor Pro. And if you're interested in some tools and stuff, I'll throw links in the description. Now I did go out and get a fish scale just for this from Walmart for $5. I have it hanging from my tree of weights and measures here. So this bike is a small frame with 27.5 inch tires, and it's weighing in at 35 pounds. So it is a bit of a thick boy right now, but hopefully we can get that changed up. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.